The rise and fall of Al Capone. He ruled Chicago with a cigar in one hand, and a Tommy gun in the other. A man who became the face of American organized crime. A name still whispered with a mix of fear and fascination. Al Capone. To some, he was a monster. To others, a modern-day Robin Hood. But behind the pinstripe suits and press clippings was a ruthless empire built on blood, booze, and bribery. This is not just the story of a gangster. This is the story of a man who bent an entire city to his will. Who rose from the slums of Brooklyn to become one of the richest and most powerful criminals in history. And who lost it all, because of taxes. This is the rise and fall of Al Capone. Part 1, Origins, Brooklyn's son. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. The fourth of 9 children in a working-class Italian immigrant family. His father, Gabriele Capone, was a barber. His mother, Teresa, a seamstress. They had left Naples in search of a better life, like so many others who sailed for America in the late 19th century. What they found was overcrowded tenements, poverty, and prejudice. Brooklyn was no place for the weak. And young Al learned early that fists spoke louder than words. At school, he clashed with teachers. He was smart, but defiant. At age 14, after striking a female teacher, he was expelled. He never went back. Instead, he turned to the streets. He joined local kid gangs, first the Junior 40 Thieves, then the Bowery Boys. By his mid-teens, he'd caught the eye of more serious figures, the 5 Points Gang, one of the most feared and organized criminal groups in New York. The 5 Points Gang was a training ground for future mob legends. And Capone was a quick study. He learned how to fight. How to threaten. How to survive. But more importantly, how to obey the code. Around this time, Capone started working at the Harvard Inn, a saloon and brothel in Coney Island run by gangster Frankie Yale. It was here that he would earn the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Scarface. One night, after insulting a woman, her brother slashed Capone across the face with a razor, leaving 3 deep scars. Capone survived. But his pride didn't. He hated the nickname. He preferred snorky, slang for someone classy and stylish. But the world would remember him as Scarface. Despite his rough edges, Capone was rising fast. He was big, smart, loyal, and dangerous. But most of all, he was ambitious. And soon, someone else would notice. Part 2, Chicago Bound, A New Kingdom. In 1919, Capone left New York. He was just 20 years old. He didn't have money. He didn't have power. But he had something better, an invitation. Johnny Torrio, a high-ranking gangster in Chicago, had seen potential in him. Torrio was organized, strategic, and respected. He wasn't just a street thug, he was a businessman in the business of crime. And Chicago was his city. Torrio needed muscle. Capone fit the profile. When Capone arrived in Chicago, Prohibition had just begun. The 18th Amendment made the sale and distribution of alcohol illegal across the United States. But the law didn't stop the drinking. It just moved it underground, and made it incredibly profitable. Torrio was ready. He had breweries, smugglers, speakeasies. And now, with Capone, he had enforcement. Capone quickly made himself useful. He collected debts, intimidated rivals, oversaw shipments. He drank. He fought. He charmed. He made connections, with judges, politicians, even police officers. And within just a few years, he became Torrio's most trusted man. But in 1925, everything changed. Torrio was ambushed outside his home by rival gangsters. He barely survived. After recovering, he made a decision that shocked everyone. He retired and handed his entire operation to Capone. At just 26 years old, Al Capone became the most powerful crime boss in Chicago. And he wasn't interested in keeping things quiet. He wanted an empire. Part 3: Building an Empire. Al Capone didn't inherit an empire. He built one. Brick by bloody brick. When he took control of the Chicago outfit in 1925, Capone was already feared. But he wanted more than fear. He wanted control. Wealth. Power. And he knew exactly how to get it. Prohibition had created a black market gold rush. Booze wasn't just contraband, it was currency. And Capone's empire ran on it. He expanded operations on every front. Illegal breweries popped up across the city and suburbs. Convoys of trucks moved whiskey through secret routes. Police escorts, paid with bribes, ensured shipments arrived safely. Every bar, every club, every speakeasy in Chicago had a price. And most of them paid it to Capone. His network was vast. His control, absolute. It wasn't just alcohol. Capone had his hands in gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and extortion. From the brothels of Cicero to the casinos on the South Side, he ran it all. And the money flowed. At its peak, Capone's criminal empire generated an estimated $100 million a year. That's over $1.5 billion in today's dollars. He employed over 1,000 men. Lieutenants, accountants, drivers, smugglers, hitmen. And each of them knew, loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal was punished. Capone didn't trust many, but he chose his inner circle carefully. Frank Nitti handled business logistics and was one of the few men Capone truly relied on. Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn handled enforcement, his favorite assassin. McGurn's specialty was public executions, always loud, always messy. A warning to everyone. But Capone was more than just a crime boss. He was a businessman. He ran his empire like a corporation. Departments for distribution. Systems for payoffs. Audits, coded, of course, to track income. He even had a public relations strategy. Capone cultivated an image. The charismatic king of Chicago. He wore tailored suits, Italian shoes, diamond pinky rings. He smiled for the press. Gave witty interviews. Told reporters he was just a humble businessman, a second-hand furniture dealer. To the public, he wasn't just a gangster. He was a celebrity. People lined up to shake his hand. Women asked for his autograph. He appeared in magazines. Spoke to journalists by name. And he gave back, strategically. When the stock market crashed in 1929, and soup kitchens overflowed with desperate families, Capone opened his own. Feeding thousands every day. No questions asked. It wasn't charity. It was optics. A gangster who looked like a saint. But make no mistake, his empire was built on blood. The streets of Chicago ran red with the cost of his success. Rival gangs pushed back. Irish crews, Italian holdouts, independents. Capone responded with overwhelming force. He bombed bars that wouldn't buy his liquor. Burned down clubs that refused his protection. Had uncooperative business owners beaten, or worse. Witnesses disappeared. Enemies turned up in alleys, riddled with bullets. Capone's rule was absolute. But it wasn't unchallenged. The North Side Gang, led by Bugs Moran, remained his most dangerous rival. They controlled a large part of the city, and refused to bow. Assassination attempts on Capone became frequent. Bombings. Ambushes. Snipers. He survived them all. But he didn't forgive. He moved constantly. Traveled in bulletproof cars. Surrounded himself with armed bodyguards. He once told a reporter, I've been accused of every crime but stealing a baby's milk bottle. Maybe I'm just misunderstood. But he knew what he was doing. And he knew what was coming. Because when you build a throne out of corpses, someone eventually comes for the crown. Part 4, Public Persona vs. Crime Boss. Al Capone may have been a gangster. But he understood something most criminals never did. Perception is power. While his enemies hid in the shadows, Capone stepped into the spotlight. He wasn't just running Chicago's underworld, he was performing for it. He wore custom suits tailored from fine Italian wool. His shoes were handmade. His fedoras, always sharp. He smoked cigars like a king and rode in bulletproof Cadillacs like a president. He dined at the city's finest restaurants. Tipped extravagantly. Treated reporters like old friends. And for the first time in American history, a gangster became a celebrity. To the press, he was a walking contradiction. Charming but dangerous. Smiling but deadly. He called himself a businessman, but his business ran on violence. Capone gave interviews freely. When asked about the violence in Chicago, he shrugged. "I'm just supplying a demand," he'd say. "If the people don't want it, there's no business." That's America. And in a way, he was right. Prohibition had created a nation of lawbreakers. And Capone had become their supplier. Liquor flowed through his empire like water through pipes. And the people loved him for it. But his most powerful move wasn't supplying booze. It was supplying hope. When the Great Depression hit, and people lined up for bread, Capone opened a soup kitchen on the South Side. Fed over 2,000 people a day, free of charge. The sign outside read, "Free soup, coffee and donuts for the unemployed." It was a publicity masterstroke. Photos of grateful mothers and hungry children filled newspapers. And behind them, always, Al Capone. He paid school teachers when the city couldn't. Donated to charities. Gave Christmas turkeys to poor families. Was it generosity? Or manipulation? Maybe both. To the public, he was a protector. To the press, a perfect story. To the poor, a provider. But behind the polished image, behind the soup kitchens and smiles, was the real Capone. A man who ruled with fear. A man who ordered killings without hesitation. A man who laughed with you, and then buried you. His enemies knew the truth. He'd publicly denounce violence. Then have a man shot 20 times in broad daylight. He'd shake hands with officials at City Hall. And have them on his payroll hours later. He once ordered the kidnapping of a rival's brother. Tortured him. Sent him home in pieces. No one could touch him. No jury would convict him. No witness would testify. Because everyone feared Al Capone. Even those who loved him. This dual life, celebrity and criminal, was his greatest weapon. He made himself too public to be eliminated. Too admired to be replaced. Too powerful to be ignored. But not too powerful to fall. Because even legends have limits. And Capone's image was about to shatter, in a burst of gunfire so brutal. Even his loyal supporters couldn't look away. Part 5, Gang Wars, Blood on the Streets. Chicago in the 1920s wasn't a city. It was a battlefield. Behind every jazz club, behind every speakeasy, behind every bottle of illegal liquor, there was a war. A war for power, territory, and survival. And at the center of it all, was Al Capone. But Capone didn't run the city alone. He had enemies, dangerous ones. The most serious of them all, the North Side Gang. Their leader was Dean O'Banion. An Irish gangster, smart and unpredictable, who controlled the North Side's alcohol trade. Where Capone brought charm, O'Banion brought chaos. At first, there was a truce. A careful balance of power. Each gang controlled its own slice of the city. No one crossed the line. Until someone did. In 1924, after a series of betrayals and ambushes, Johnny Torrio, Capone's mentor, gave the green light. O'Banion was gunned down in his flower shop. 3 shots to the chest. 1 to the head. The message was clear. Capone plays for keeps. But killing O'Banion didn't end the war. It escalated it. Bugs Moran, one of O'Banion's top men, rose to power. And Moran didn't fear Capone. He was reckless, violent, and hell-bent on revenge. What followed was a storm of blood. Car bombs exploded in the streets. Bullets ripped through restaurants. Gunmen disguised as police raided enemy clubs. Capone's men struck first. Moran's men struck back. The city became a war zone. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear. Stray bullets hit civilians. Bodies turned up in alleys, hotel rooms, doorsteps. The newspapers ran daily headlines of gangland murders. Chicago earned a new name, the City of Scars. Capone moved constantly. He never stayed in one place for more than a night. He traveled with dozens of bodyguards. A fleet of armored cars. Gunmen at every exit. His paranoia was well earned. There were multiple attempts on his life. Snipers. Car chases. Bombs under his car. He survived them all. But each attempt made him more cautious. More ruthless. Capone wasn't interested in peace anymore. He was interested in dominance. He told his men, "Don't bring me deals. Bring me blood." And blood they brought. His favorite hitman, Jack McGurn, became the architect of retaliations. A machine gun in his hands was more of a message than a weapon. Entire crews were wiped out overnight. Warehouses burned to the ground. Delivery trucks hijacked and turned into fireballs on public roads. But Moran wouldn't yield. The North Side gang held their territory like a fortress. And with every failed hit, Capone's patience wore thinner. He needed something bigger. Something louder. Something final. And in 1929, he would get it. An act so violent, so cold, that it would shock the nation. And mark the beginning of Capone's end. Part 6, The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. February 14, 1929. A cold morning in Chicago. The streets were quiet. Snow blanketed the sidewalks. People exchanged flowers, chocolates, and cards, celebrating Valentine's Day. But inside a garage on North Clark Street, death was waiting. 7 members of the North Side gang had gathered. Most of them were Moran's men. They were expecting a shipment of stolen whiskey. What they got was an ambush. At around 10:30 a.m., 2 men dressed as police officers entered the garage. Behind them, 2 more followed, plain clothes, armed. No one resisted. They thought it was just another raid. They were wrong. The men were lined up against a brick wall. And then, gunfire. Tommy guns roared, spraying the room with bullets. 70 rounds fired in less than a minute. 7 men dead, most shot in the back. 2 of them were still breathing when police arrived. One was asked who shot him. His answer: "Nobody." The message was clear. You don't talk. Even when you're dying. One of the victims had his face blown off. Another had been shot 14 times. The floor was slick with blood. Shell casings littered the ground like cigarette butts. The brick wall behind them was pocked with holes, frozen in time. It was the single most brutal gangland killing in American history. And though the public didn't know it yet, everyone understood who had ordered it. Al Capone. Except he had an alibi. He was in Florida at the time, hundreds of miles away. Resting in a hotel. Soaking in the sun. Untouchable. No arrests were made. No one testified. No one spoke. But everyone knew. The massacre made national headlines. Front pages across the country screamed. Chicago's Valentine Day horror. Suddenly, Capone's public image, his charm, his suits, his soup kitchens, meant nothing. The blood had finally spilled over the line. Americans who once admired him now recoiled. Politicians called for his arrest. The president himself demanded action. Capone had won the war against Moran. But in doing so, he had lost something far more valuable. His invisibility. Before, he was a rumor. Now, he was a target. The government began closing in. Not with guns, but with something far more dangerous to a gangster. Accountants. Part 7, Lawmen Strike Back, The Untouchables. After this Valentine's Day Massacre, the message was clear. Al Capone was no longer just a gangster. He was a national threat. And Washington had taken notice. President Herbert Hoover, under growing public pressure, gave a private order. Get Capone. Not wound him. Not scare him. Take him down, for good. But that wouldn't be easy. Capone had survived shootouts, ambushes, and rival gangs. He had outwitted Chicago police, bribed judges, bought elections. He was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Bullets hadn't stopped him. But the government had something else in mind. They would go after his money. The strategy was simple, but bold. If they couldn't prove he pulled the trigger, they'd prove he never paid taxes. And while federal accountants started digging through every dollar Capone had ever touched, another team went after his operations on the ground. That team was led by a young federal agent named Elliot Ness. Clean-cut. Honest. Relentless. Ness was chosen for one reason. He couldn't be bought. He built a special unit, hand-picked agents with spotless records. They were incorruptible. Unafraid. And ruthless in their own way. The press gave them a name. The Untouchables. Ness and his team launched a wave of raids. Illegal breweries. Hidden distilleries. Underground clubs. They smashed barrels, arrested bootleggers, seized trucks. They burned millions of dollars worth of Capone's liquor. But Capone? He wasn't worried. He offered Ness a bribe, $2,000 a week. Ness refused. So Capone sent threats. Still, Ness didn't back down. With every raid, Capone's empire bled money. Not enough to break him, but enough to hurt. But the real damage was happening elsewhere. While Ness made headlines, the IRS worked in silence. They built a case around Capone's spending. Tracked his bank accounts. Watched his properties, his cars, his lifestyle. He claimed no income. Filed no tax returns. But lived like a king. That, they argued, was fraud. And fraud was a crime. It took years to build the case. Years of gathering records, flipping informants, surviving threats. Capone laughed it off. He told reporters. They got nothing. You can't collect legal taxes on illegal money. He thought he was invincible. He wasn't. In 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone. Not for murder. Not for bootlegging. Not for racketeering. But for tax evasion. 22 counts. Each carrying serious prison time. The trial began that fall. Capone's lawyers tried everything. They bribed jurors. Threatened witnesses. Stalled proceedings. But the judge switched the jury at the last second. The trial moved forward, under tight security. Capone sat in court wearing his best suit. He smiled. He cracked jokes. But inside, he knew the game was changing. And when the verdict came down, guilty. The sentence: 11 years in federal prison. A $50,000 fine. Court costs. And the loss of everything he thought he'd built to last. The King of Chicago was going to prison. Not with a gun in his hand, but with a tax bill in his pocket. Part 8, The Trap, Prison in Decline. October 1931. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. 11 years in federal prison. Al Capone didn't flinch. He adjusted his tie. Forced a smirk. But beneath the surface, he was stunned. He had faced bullets, bombs, betrayals. And now he was going down for taxes. But the sentence was real. The cell was waiting. He was taken to the Cook County Jail to await transfer. Reporters crowded the streets. Photographers pushed to capture the moment. The mighty Al Capone, who once ruled Chicago like a king, was now reduced to prisoner number 40886. His first stop was Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. It wasn't Alcatraz, not yet. But it wasn't comfortable either. Capone tried to bring the old rules with him. He bribed guards. Lived in relative comfort. Had furniture brought in. Rumors swirled of fancy meals and special privileges. But the warden noticed. And so did Washington. In 1934, the Justice Department made a decision. They moved Capone to the nation's most secure prison. The end of the line. Alcatraz. Perched on a rocky island off the coast of San Francisco. Alcatraz was built for men like Capone. Hard. Isolated. Escape-proof. Here, there were no bribes. No special treatment. No hiding. Capone was stripped of his comforts, his power, his connections. Just another inmate. He worked in the prison laundry. A former crime lord, folding bedsheets. And worse, his health was beginning to fail. For years, Capone had been hiding a secret. A disease he'd contracted back in his early days working brothels in Brooklyn. Syphilis. Untreated, it had progressed. And now, in isolation, it began to eat away at him. Not just physically, but mentally. He grew paranoid. Irrational. He forgot names, faces, even where he was. Some days, he talked to people who weren't there. Other days, he sat for hours, staring into nothing. He'd once commanded an empire. Now, he couldn't even command a sentence. In 1939, after serving about 7.5 years, Capone was released early for good behavior and declining health. He was broken. Not by gunfights. Not by lawmen. But by time and disease. He returned to Florida, Palm Island, where he owned a mansion. Once a place of parties, it became his cage. There were no more visitors. No meetings. No suits. Capone spent his days fishing in the backyard canal. Listening to records. Being bathed and fed by family members. He was 40 years old. But his mind? Closer to 80. Doctors said his mental age was that of a child. By the mid-1940s, the press had forgotten him. The outfit had moved on. A new generation of criminals was rising. And Capone? He was fading. On January 25, 1947, Alphonse Gabriel Capone died of cardiac arrest. He was 48 years old. The man who had once terrorized a city was buried in a quiet cemetery outside Chicago. No headlines. No ceremony. Just a gravestone. And silence. Part 9, Legacy, The Myth of Capone. Al Capone is long gone. Dead. Buried. Forgotten by the streets he once ruled. But his name still echoes through history. More than 75 years after his death, Capone remains the most famous gangster in American history. Not because he was the most violent, or even the most successful, but because he became something no criminal had before him. A myth. Capone's story has been retold in books, movies, documentaries, and songs. He inspired Hollywood classics, like Scarface and The Untouchables. Actors from Rod Steiger to Robert De Niro have played him. He became the model of the mob boss. The mix of charm and menace, elegance and savagery. But who was he, really? To some, Capone was a monster. He flooded Chicago with illegal booze, corrupted entire systems, and had rivals gunned down in the street. He turned violence into business, fear into currency, murder into management. To others, he was a product of his time. Prohibition made ordinary citizens into criminals. Capone just filled a need, and made a fortune doing it. And to a few, he was even something of a hero. He fed the poor. Hired the jobless. Gave people a sense of order in a chaotic world. The government couldn't stop corruption. Capone could. But that version is easy to romanticize. It forgets the bodies. The blood. The fear. Capone ruled through terror. He didn't lift people up, he bought them. And when they stopped being useful, he buried them. What makes Capone's legacy so lasting isn't just what he did. It's how he changed America. He showed the nation the true scale of organized crime. How corruption could run from the streets all the way to City Hall. How violence could be hidden behind smiles, behind cigars, behind silk suits. His case led to the expansion of federal law enforcement powers. The IRS grew stronger. The FBI gained momentum. The federal government realized it could take down crime, without ever firing a shot. And in the end, that was the irony of Al Capone. He ruled with guns. He silenced witnesses. He burned businesses. But it wasn't a bullet that stopped him. It was paperwork. A tax return he never filed. A lifestyle he couldn't explain. An audit he didn't see coming. Capone died in silence. But the world he helped create lived on. His name became legend. His story, a warning. And his shadow still lingers in every gangster film, every mob novel, every whisper of the word mafia. Because Al Capone wasn't just a man. He was a message. Al Capone rose from the gutters of Brooklyn to the throne of Chicago's criminal empire. He built a fortune, ruled a city, defied the law. And lost it all. Not in a gunfight. Not in a courtroom drama. But slowly, silently. As the walls he built began to crumble. His life was a lesson. A warning. And a legend. But Capone's story is just one chapter. Because while he reigned over the streets of Chicago, across the Atlantic, another empire was rising. Older. Darker. More secretive. More powerful. A syndicate with its own codes. Its own rituals. Its own laws. The Sicilian Mafia. La Cosa Nostra. Next time, we travel to the hills of Corleone. The bloodlines of vendetta. And the origins of organized crime as the world knows it today. The Mafia didn't begin in America. It began in Sicily. Don't miss it. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe for more deep dive stories from the world of organized crime. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and tell us. Was Al Capone a criminal mastermind? Or just the right thug at the wrong time?